next speaker for the proposition.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, honorable guest to the Oxford Union. In his book, Future Shock, Alvin Toffler writes, "The illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write. It will be those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn." This idea bases itself that perhaps the premise of the handicap of the 21st century will actually be a lack of proximity to a truly fluid learning process, cautioning us that to remain entrenched in institutions that prize literacy above experiential learning will risk to fail ourselves and the challenges before us in this century. I would argue that this thread of thought relates directly to the question at hand, whether or not an institution whose perceived success is somehow tied to the number of static facts that the people who attend it are able to accumulate, memorize, and in turn regurgitate, has anything near the responsive thought process that allows it to truly be an innovator, let alone a social innovation organization. We all know that universities are not by nature risk takers, nor is their tolerance for deviance what it was in the 1960s or 70s. In fact, they become largely politically correct in nature. After all, it is hard to hold accountable and even harder to evaluate the performance of someone who's truly thinking out of the box. Yet for any innovative and entrepreneurial approaches to be developed, the component of risk must be present. More than present, it must be prevalent. I have hundreds of young people who come to work with me every year at Barefoot College, many of whom come from the finest educational institutions around the world. They all think they're experts. And they're expert until they're standing in front of a rural, poor community with human beings who live on less than $2 a day. And they must establish a relationship with those human beings that has nothing to do with the grades they got, the papers they wrote, the academic accolades. It has to do with the substance of knowing who they are and how they will speak to another human being. To stand before a community takes courage. To stand before a human being in a worse situation than you takes bravery, compassion, humility. And this we do not learn in a classroom. In fact, I don't remember taking Humility 101 at any of the universities I went to. I learned humility living beside 200 rural grassroots, incredibly innovative and resourceful human beings who teach me every single day what I do not know. A fluidity of thought that leads to a fluidity of action is the single most important element in being truly adaptive to the conditions, hurdles, barriers, and obstacles that all social innovators must and do face. Universities today within social innovation programs far too often focus on market-based solutions and impact metrics and plans. Social innovation departments are too often housed within business schools and not in colleges of the humanities. Indeed, the very skills we need in order to succeed require an engagement with messiness, with the messiness of human beings, the unpredictability, the unaccountability of human beings. It cannot be crunched into a syllabus. It cannot be measured in an incremental way. We don't get tested on our interpersonal skills at university. The esteemed Pamela Hartigan, former director of the Skoll Center for Social Entrepreneurship, wrote, "Whatever day it is in the world, something has changed. Figure out what it is and what it means. Forget what you just did and what you just learned. Start fresh every day. To be effective, one must be a continual student of everything we do, able to wake from one day to the next, set aside all the facts that we might have accumulated because they are no longer relevant to a particular situation. Nothing could be further than what we're taught at university. We must assimilate geographic, environmental, political, cultural, economic security, and a host of other conditions that bear on any social challenge or situation of inequality. We must be able to absorb a level of complexity that can only be answered by a highly developed intuition, I would argue. The very term social innovation implies a critical element, a deeply rooted propensity towards entrepreneurial behavior, a continual redefinition and reevaluation of a specific ecosystem, in short, being constantly that ever-present student. Genuine innovators, entrepreneurs, social and otherwise, are so often characterized by words such as passion, perseverance, values, empathy, hard work, and of course, creativity. Einstein said, imagination is far more important than knowledge. And I'm not sure that our universities do anywhere near an adequate job of fostering and developing imagination. It is the skills of unlearning and relearning at an almost exponential speed, which are exactly what we will all have to master if we are to keep pace with the coming trajectory of innovation and its impact in our lives. The exponential nature of the velocity of change that will happen in the next 100 years in comparison to what has happened in the previous 100 years is something none of us can even yet comprehend. When we entertain this thought, we think of things like artificial intelligence or self-driving cars, but imagine the same velocity is happening in all the negative things: climate change, food security, water security, conflict. More specifically, the velocity of innovation within the developing world and often within the most resource-poor or challenged communities themselves must be seen, recognized, respected, and built upon for genuine solutions to actually evolve that will stay. It would be the height of arrogance to imagine that anyone could grasp from a classroom at a university at distance the speed with which innovation happens when people's survival is at stake. When they tire of the barriers that block them from reaching their aspirations. Universities are simply not structured to mirror that velocity of innovation that is born of urgent and immediate need and survival in real time, nor to be able to support it or grasp it effectively from afar. This kind of responsiveness is a rigor unto itself, a discipline that refuses to allow a stagnation of thought, entrenched viewpoints, and a set of fixed information points to limit it. I put before you that universities, as they are currently structured and indeed set up as business models in many cases, operate largely today as corporations with their own priorities, often conflicting ones, institutional biases, a certain arrogance that are simply unable to teach in a distilled setting the kinds of skills essential for them or their students to be credible or effective agents of social innovation. In looking at even broader systems change, which will require a far grander and more complex level of collaboration, universities who work within silos are largely unable to teach set an example of the disciplines that help us to remove power dynamics and personal ownership for solutions to truly reach collaborative solutions. Systemic change approaches and the humility to engage in them implies a potential of losing your unique identity, and universities prize and reward the connection between an individual and his or her unique idea. If we honestly use the lens of the past to look at what have been the catalysts to the most disruptive shifts and jolts from one status quo to the next, they are not universities or even the institutions that were built upon the formulation of ideas separate from action, nor from critical thought or expertise. They were individuals. They were human beings whose proximity, above all, to those in whom they lost themselves and served, who have driven the largest movements of real social innovation.